Welcome to the Pat Sheranian Show, and thank you so much for joining us today. You're either watching us on PatUtahValleyLive.com or you're watching on KHQN 1480 AM. We're so thankful you're with us today because I have an extraordinary guest with me. He has just arrived from New York, and you're going to want to tell your friends. So get ready to make phone calls to let people know where we are for sure. Welcome, Sherman Fleek, and I should say Lieutenant Colonel Sherman Fleek. He is many things, and today we're going to be talking about his career. We're going to be talking about his past, his present, and his future, and his books. He has written 2 amazing books, and they're wonderful books. We want to share those with you, where you can get them and what they're all about. So stay with us. I'm going to mention Kyani as our major sponsor today. As you know, I ran into Kyani. It ran into me in July of 2010. I had been diabetic, high blood pressure, high cholesterol, crippling arthritis for many years, over 14 years. And when I started taking these products, by the end of the month, I was off of all medication. Day before yesterday, I went in to see the doctor after 15 months. I have not had any medication. My blood sugars are normal. High blood pressure is normal. My blood sugars, everything is normal, including cholesterol. And my hands are crippled, but no pain, and I can make a fist. So I love Kyani, KYANI.net, if you're interested in looking that up. And to get hold of me and talk about it, 801-362-9552, 362-9552. And you can just be a customer and enjoy the products. You can build a business, which is what I'm doing, and it's been a lot of fun. So thank you, Kyani. How are you?
I'm fine, Pat. How are you?
I'm so glad to have you here. We met online through Boyd Tuttle, who is your publisher of these great books. And I thought this is a great subject. I've heard about the Mormon Battalion. I know about as much as you could put on the top of a pin. But just a few minutes this morning in visiting, I'm intrigued by the way you have written this. These are not history books that we're talking about.
Well, they're historical fiction, historical novels.
And that seems to be something that's becoming more and more popular because there's such a storyline to it. I heard you mention earlier that Gerald Lunn may have made that breakthrough. Is that helping to help us understand?
In the LDS history world in the 1990s, when his books came forth, they were so popular that they've really set a trend, and there's a bunch of others who have jumped on different wagons to tell different stories of LDS history. So he was a pioneer and it's very popular, and he dealt with the restoration. And the books, I believe, ended entering into the Valley of the Great Salt Lake.
Great. Well, I want you to know a little bit more about this gentleman because there is so much to know about him. So we're going to talk a little bit about, let's start with where were you raised, because we like Utahns.
Well, I was born at Hill Air Force Base up by Layton in Clearfield, Utah. My father was a 30-year man, Army. He was in the cavalry. He was on the horseback cavalry in the 1930s during the Depression, and then Army Air Corps, Army Air Forces, and the Air Force. So I was delivered by a first lieutenant at Hill Air Force Base.
There you go. You're really a son of Utah for sure. Let's talk a little bit, because I'm looking at this whole list of wonderful awards that you have you've received, and then some that aren't here. I'm going to ask about those. So Lieutenant Colonel Flex, did I say Fleeks?
Fleeks.
Some of his awards. Would you share those with me, because I certainly don't know what they are. I'm sure people listening do, and if you've got friends that are historians and love really LDS history, and then some. Then let's get hold of it, and then we're going to tell you where he's working, what he's representing in his real life, other than an author.
Well, the military awards I've received are based on achievement and service and so on. I served 25 years in the Army on active duty, both as an enlisted soldier and then commissioned as an officer. I did not serve in combat as a green suit soldier, but the highest award I received was the Legion of Merit. And if you go by precedence, that falls under the Silver Star and above the Bronze Star.
Oh my goodness, great.
And so, and then I have others, Defense Meritorious Service Medal. I have a Master Aviator badge. I think I'm wearing it here.
There you are. I see the wings, yeah.
Yeah, I was a Master Aviator in the Army, parachutist, air assault badge, and then also Special Forces. When I was younger and skinnier, I jumped out of perfectly good airplanes, and I wore a Green Beret and ate snakes and did those things for 3 years.
That's more than I want to know.
Then I saw the light and went to flight school and got flight pay.
Well, we mentioned briefly earlier because I was raised in Fayetteville, North Carolina.
Yes.
And Fort Bragg.
Fort Bragg.
And you had history I'd never heard of, even though I went through school there.
Well, Braxton Bragg was in the Federal Army before the Civil War, and then he resigned his commission as a captain, and when the Civil War started, became eventually a general in the Confederate Army.
Wow, see, I didn't know that.
Yes,
those years.
He was one of those guys.
As a matter of fact, the first church service I actually went to was on at Fort Bragg, because in Fayetteville we didn't have enough priesthood in the LDS church to hold a meeting. But we did on the Army base at Fort Bragg, so that's where we went to Sunday school when I was just in elementary school and growing up. So that place has always been dear to my heart.
Fort Bragg.
So thank you for bringing that up and letting me know about that. Let's go back and let's catch where you are now, and what you're doing, and why you're doing it, and who you're doing it for.
I am.
Pick a question.
Well, my current position, I am the command historian for the United States Military Academy at West Point. Let me tell you a cute thing real quick. When I got that position 3 years ago, I called one of my sisters and told her that I was given the opportunity to be the historian at West Point. She said, "Oh, well, that's great. Does that mean you're moving home to Utah?"
Where does she think West Point is?
Well, there's a little West Point town west of Ogden.
Oh, there is. You're right.
Out
There
by
is
Clinton,
called
out by
West Point.
Hooper,
And you
out
were
by
coming home.
Syracuse. And I said, no, the other West Point.
The real
The one on the
big one.
Hudson, you know, where Patton and Pershing and Lee and Grant and Sherman and all those guys went to school. And that was
Well,
interesting.
I'm curious about your first name.
Sherman, yes, a tank. My father named me after a tank, yes. I was named after his uncle, Sherman Trowbridge, in Kansas. My father was born and raised in Kansas. And I'm sure he was named after the Civil War General William Tecumseh Sherman, who was class of 1840 at West Point. Every time I have a speaking engagement, my boss wants me to mention West Point as many times as possible.
So you're doing it.
So I'm supposed to do at least 10 or 15 times.
Tell us about life, though, where you live and on being there,
Yeah.
and what you do. And really, you gave your title, but let's talk about what that really means.
Okay. Well, everyone thinks when they meet me that I am on faculty, and I teach. I don't. I am responsible for the history of West Point, and I'm in my third year there. So I do websites and tours, commemorations. We're in the middle of the sesquicentennial of the history, the 150th of the Civil War. Next June will be the kickoff for the bicentennial of the War of 1812, the first conflict that West Point graduates served in. And so I write an annual history every year required by the Army. I'm Army civilian. I'm no longer in the Army. And my history last year was 350 pages long.
Wow.
1 year worth of history. It's about as boring as you can possibly read, because it's just a lot of information which historians later, when they're doing other works, it's like an encyclopedia or a dictionary, an anthology, something like that, to where there's a lot of facts that you can glean and use for other purposes.
So you're a researcher. Researchers come and look and see what you've written.
Right.
Okay.
And I host things like that. But my principal job is I am the advisor to a lieutenant general, the
Okay.
superintendent, a 3-star general, on all history matters. So when he has a question about the Army and the history, or the history of West Point, even though he's a graduate, and I'm not a graduate of West Point, he'll come to me or his staff, the chief of staff, one of those people, and ask me questions and things of that nature.
Good.
So I advise him on historical matters, like the chaplain advises him on religious spiritual matters, and the JAG officers, the Judge Adjutant Generals, advise him on legal issues. I advise him on history matters.
Well, what I'll say to that is, wow. Let's talk about some of the articles and things that you have written, and starting with the Mexican War.
Most people think historians know everything about all history. I can talk about the 100 Years' War if I had to, but my expertise is the Mexican War, the Civil War, and the Frontier Army. I've read quite a bit in World War II, Vietnam, that era, World War I. I have a book out on biography of a World War I American soldier, but that's where I...
Is that a novel?
No, it's a biography.
Okay.
It's the first Latter-day Saint to receive the Medal of Honor.
Oh.
A biography, Thomas Niebuhr, from Sugar City, Idaho.
Oh, for goodness sakes. Now, you're going to be on KSL later.
I've been doing some programs with the Sunday programs called History of the Church. Whenever they need the military expert, not the women's expert or the pioneer expert or the trails expert, they call on me. So
you're going to be recording that?
Yeah, I've done a couple, 2-3 sessions, and I have one this afternoon.
Okay, very
Up
good.
at Fort
And we can
Douglas.
hear those on Sunday?
Whenever
You don't know yet.
whenever they plug them
When
into
they
the
plug 'em in.
program.
So
yes.
we'll watch for those on KSL. That'll be great. You've written some other books. Did we get them all mentioned here, or some articles? I would like to mention them all. History may be searched in vain, as a military history, and then the Mormon Battalion.
Well, this is a good point. I researched the Mormon Battalion when I was in graduate school at University of Colorado, and it became my thesis. I wanted to answer the question.
Okay.
The battalion never saw combat during its 1-year service, 1846, 1847. So I wanted to answer the question, were they competent? Were they ready for combat operations? So as soldiers, most of us do not see combat. I served 25 years in the Army.
That's an interesting statement, because we're in
most
the
don't.
middle of a mess right now. And
Right.
you
We
mentioned
haven't.
you have a son on a mission and another one in Iraq.
Yes, I have the unique situation right now. I have a son on a mission for the LDS Church and a son in Iraq. He's on his second tour. But most soldiers, most service members do not see combat. Those in units who are in combat see action again and again. So there's nothing fair in life, and it's a matter of luck, good luck or bad luck, however you want to look at it. But I wanted, since the battalion did not see any combat, I wanted to answer the question, were they capable? Were they
This is
ready?
the Mormon Battalion.
The Mormon Battalion.
Okay.
And so the way we gauge that in the modern Army back then is discipline, esprit de corps, their training, leadership, and if they have any infractions and discipline problems. Folks that desert, soldiers that desert, or will strike an officer, things of that nature. So those are all the important ingredients that even today commanders look at to evaluate units, see if they're ready for combat operations.
That's interesting, things we would not necessarily think about.
Well, that's why they pay us green suiters to do that.
Well, let's talk about the Mormon Battalion. Let's
Okay.
start there, because they had choices. They had so many choices. And one of the things was a little minor thing, but they were given uniforms, or they could send the money home. And I thought that was just kind of an interesting, they had so many more choices than we think of now. Now, maybe that's not so. So straighten me out.
Well, that's a wonderful myth, and I appreciate you bringing that up because it's a great point. The book, History May Be Searched in Vain, was published in 2006. It is a scholarly history of the Mormon Battalion. So I had that published through Arthur H. Clarke and Company. Now it's part of University of Oklahoma Press. So the uniform issue. We went from an army of 9,000 to 117,000 in 6 months during the Mexican War in 1846. They didn't have any uniforms to issue at Fort Leavenworth. They were allowed a $42 uniform allowance, which most of that money went to the church and Brigham Young. But there were no uniforms to be issued, and they would have turned them down anyway. So the Missourians, the 1st and 2nd Missouri Mounted in the same war, same conflict, they didn't receive uniforms either. nor,
How did you know who was who?
how do I know?
No, well, I mean, how did they know? How did they know if they weren't in combat?
Well, because
Okay. If they
well, the
weren't in
Mexicans usually wore uniforms.
Okay.
Not always.
Okay. All
And
right.
they of course have a different racial complexion.
True.
The Mexican people, they're
Okay.
Hispanics,
Right.
more or less. And so, but the Missourians didn't receive their uniforms, nor, and this is interesting, nor did the Missourians receive a penny of pay until their 1 year service was up and they were discharged, where the battalion was paid 2 or 3 times. And the money went home to,
They didn't have any.
well, they used specie, which is gold, and then they had cash on occasion. And then in Santa Fe, they were paid in checks.
You know, there's so many things with your background and with your research that you have done over the years that you could write about. Why these 2 books? And let's hold them up.
Okay, well, let's do it.
Okay, and we'll describe it to our radio listening audience and the ones here. I think maybe if we turn it and kind of push it towards the camera a little bit. Yeah, there, you can see
There
it
we
pretty
go.
good. Okay. And this is the first one that you have written, right?
Right.
On this particular
Called The War.
subject. The war.
It's called The
Called-
War.
Called to War.
Called The
to
War, the
Okay.
dawn of the Mormon Battalion.
Okay.
So if
Now
you
this
think,
sounds heavy.
sounds heavy.
Okay. It sounds heavy. It's a big book.
Yes.
So tell us what you have done, because it's not just like reading a history book.
Right, it is a historical novel. It's like reading The Winds of War by Herman Wouk.
Okay.
War and Remembrance. Miniseries was made later in the 1980s. If you think about Charles Dickens' The Tale of Two Cities,
Right.
that's a historical novel. It depicts
is,
the
but it
history of
is.
the French Revolution.
Okay.
And so Ben-Hur is another one. It's a fictional account of the life of Christ. So historical fiction has been with us for a long time. Ivanhoe, Sir Walter Scott. You know, you have Ivanhoe's fictitious, but Richard de Lionheart was not, nor was King John and Robin Hood and all those.
Now, you've done something interesting
Yep.
in here. We're going to ask you about some of the characters in this book, because that's what threads it, are your characters. But in this book, you have very carefully listed fictional characters and historical characters. And so share some of those names with us.
All right.
And then tell us a little bit about those, because when you read a book of this type, then we want to know that we're going to have an outcome. We want the plot. So tell us a little bit about the people in the plot. Who are we going to meet? Because I don't know about most people, it's so hard for me to start reading, because I cannot stand putting a book down until I finish it. I want the thread to keep, I want the dots to connect. And so tell us who we're going to meet in this, and some of the names that are historical and some that aren't.
All right. Well, I wrote these novels because there's a whole genre or group of audience out there that doesn't really want to read the factual history books, which I love, of course. But I love fiction too. And
Well, in
so-
today's market, everybody wants everything fast. The
Well-
young people coming along, they want it quick, they want it fast, they want it over with.
Right.
Now move to the next thing.
So I decided to write these novels, and some of my historical colleagues, when they found out about it, they told me that I'd gone to the dark side. We don't do that, Sherman. Oh, okay. Well, Newt Gingrich is
We're pure.
Newt Gingrich is a PhD in history, taught at the University of Georgia, Speaker of the House,
Right.
and now he's writing novels, making a ton of money about Gettysburg and Chancellorsville. So I wanted to reach an audience. I mean, you look at Gerald Lund's success, you look at Jerry Barrowman and Dean Hughes. I haven't read any of their books, by the way.
I've read Dean's.
Have you? Okay. I haven't read their novels because I didn't want to.
Compelling. They're compelling.
Well, I'm sure they are. I just haven't read them because I didn't want to be accused of using someone else's ideas. But anyway, so I just wanted to reach a different audience than you would get with the scholarly intellectual types. And so I started writing these, and I created a fictional family, the Barlows from England, converts, Victoria, and who was Queen of Britain at that time, Queen
Right.
Victoria, and her 2 sons, York and Arthur, very good British names. But among my fictional characters, I have James K. Polk, President of the United States, Samuel F.B. Morris, who invented the telegraph. There's Abraham Lincoln in the second novel, and Kit Carson, Christopher
I'm going to hold
Carson.
that up, the second one, because I want you to describe what's on the cover.
Okay. Well, this is the second novel, and on this, on the cover is a wonderful depiction of an actual battle that occurred in 1847 in downtown LA called La Mesa.
Which really surprised me. I lived many years in West Los Angeles in the Beverly Hills area, and not once, ever, in years and years and years, did I ever hear of any kind of fort in downtown Los Angeles.
Well, it's interesting because on the 8th of January 1847, the Americans defeated the Californios, the Mexican lancers, at San Gabriel, the river, the San Gabriel River, which is nothing but concrete today.
Right, it is concrete.
And so the next day, there was another battle at La Mesa, a couple miles more to the west. And it's hard to see probably, but in the center here
Push it out forward
are
just a little bit.
dismounted, that means they're off their horses,
Okay.
dragoons, which are cavalrymen. And they're in a Napoleonic square with their hulls, breech-loading carbines. And they're fighting, shooting against the Californios, who are attacking mounted with lances.
Oh, my.
With lances. And it's an actual battle. This is a wonderful.
Is this a painting?
It's a painting
Yeah,
by
okay.
a Charles Waterhouse, Colonel, United States Marine Corps Reserve, done in the 1970s.
It's absolutely beautiful.
Yeah, it is. That's why I picked this for the cover.
Okay, now,
But-
you mentioned something in the second book, and I got you off subject there. Can we go back and pick that thread up? I can't remember what it was. So,
Well, you were asking me who are some of the historical
okay, right,
characters.
right.
Well, in these novels, unlike some novelists, I take no license. That means everything in them is exactly historically accurate as I know it. If there's any mistakes or errors, they're mine. But having been an authority on the battalion for a number of years and another book out on it, which gained great reviews, by the way.
Well, why this subject? I mean,
Well-
with your background, you could have written about a lot of things. Why?
Let me answer that in a minute.
Okay.
Because
Okay.
I want to finish this thought
Okay.
here.
Okay.
Is the aspect that, that everything in them are absolutely accurate. Now, I may have a scene portrayed or depicted through fictional eyes or historical characters or both. And sometimes I plug them in and so on. But that's just the aspect of using fiction to develop plots and characters and to help people understand what people went through. Now here's the answer to your question.
Okay.
The whole purpose of these novels, these two right now, and if I do any more, and all depend if you people buy my books,
Right. It's up to you.
is the aspect of I want to tell the LDS military story. Now, we've been biting around the edges for many years, and some folks have done some great work, like Jerry Barrowman and Dean Hughes and others. There's books about different military leaders and so on, Utah War and all that. But no one has put it all together, and so I'm looking at the opportunity, if I feel engaged and I'm having fun and I'm enjoying them, and people react to them, appreciate them, that I will continue these novels and have 4 or 5 generations of Barlows.
Wow.
We'll go through the Civil War. We'll go through the Utah War, which is the next novel, and I've started it already. The Utah War and the Mountain Meadows Massacre.
Oh, okay.
Inseparable, can't talk about one without the other.
Right.
And then the build up towards the Civil War. And we know of at least 500 Latter-day Saints that served in the Civil War on both sides, North and South. A lot of that work's being done at BYU at the Saints at War Center. But, and then we have the Indian Wars, and then the Spanish-American War. And then when Pancho Villa raided across the border in 1916 during the Mexican Revolution, and then he was chased back down, or the punitive expedition by General Blackjack Pershing. Well, guess where they based all his supplies and logistics out of? Colonial Dublin, a Mormon colony in Chihuahua.
Oh,
So Mormons were right there with George Patton, lieutenant, and General Pershing. And it's amazing. Patton had an interesting firefight, actually a gunfight. He killed 3 Mexicans with his pearl-handled revolvers, like depicted in the movie.
Right.
Well, his driver there, who killed one of them also, there was 4 or 5 involved in this, was a Mormon driver,
Oh, for
a
goodness
scout.
sakes.
These guys knew Spanish, they knew the area, they were Mexican citizens, and they were helping the U.S. Army stop the different raids and so on that Pancho Villa and his group were doing. There were several different segments or factions of Mexico fighting each other.
Now, I know you don't want to hear this word, but I have to ask the question.
All
Is
right.
this going to be a series?
It may turn into a series. I will write as long as I'm having fun and they're successful.
Well, if you've just joined us, I have a most wonderful guest with me today, Lieutenant Colonel Sherman Fleek. He has an extraordinary background. He is employed by, is that how I would say that?
U.S. Army.
U.S. Army at West Point to
Yep.
write their history.
Right.
And has won many awards and medals through his life, amazing life. One of these days, you really should write about yourself, you know.
Oh, well.
Yeah, well, one of these days. I know people. I've heard authors all the time. They write about everything, and then here you're the most interesting. But these books, let's hold them up again for our audience. And we do have a chat room. If you're watching on pat.utahvalleylive.com, then send us a note. So this is called Call to War, is the first book.
Dawn of the Mormon Battalion.
Right. And it has a family, so we're going to, do we follow the family into the second
Oh, yeah. Yes, the Barlows were there.
into the
Yeah,
second
the
book?
Barlows.
Then let's hold up the other book also. And let's mention the publisher is Boyd Tuttle, and he owns Digital Legend Press. And I had Boyd on the air with me last week. A very interesting man, and he's got so many books that are selling and flying off the bookshelves. Now these books can be found where? Deseret Book?
Yes, they sell at Deseret, BYU Bookstore. They're in Amazon,
Oh, good.
and then on Boyd's website, and others, Barnes & Noble, and
Okay, and his website, is it on this card? Yeah, it's digitallegend.com. That's easy. Digitallegend.com. And if you have a book and you want to get it published, he's a good man to call because you don't have to buy 5,000 of them at one time. They're on demand, which really is a whole different ball game now, thank goodness. Do you know the price that they're selling for in the bookstores by any chance?
$24.95, I believe, yes.
Okay, $24.95. Well, and they've got a lot of, we've got 400 pages here?
$5.45 and
$5.45.
$5.25.
So good reading.
Well,
Good reading.
interesting story while there's 2.
Because I'm not a writer, and I can tell stories, but I'm not a writer, military history I would find would be probably not on top of everybody's list. But I think you made the plot. You mentioned some of the people now. I want to know a little bit about the plot. What happens to these people? I don't expect you to give me the whole story, but how about a half hour's worth? Because it's the plot.
Half an hour's worth.
We go to a movie because we've heard the plot is good, or it isn't. And sometimes the acting isn't, but the plot will carry it.
Right.
So in writing a book, it has to be compelling. And so what makes this type of book compelling to me, is that I'm going to learn about a history I don't know that much about, heard briefly through church classes and so forth. But it's the characters usually are the compelling ones that keep us tied. So share some plot with me. Not enough that you do the whole thing, because of course we want them to go and buy the book.
My undergraduate at Brigham Young University was in English, and somehow I made it through. And then I finished ROTC and was commissioned. So we learned that plot is basically, the best plots is a conflict and development. Man against man, man against nature, man against himself. I guess woman against woman too, and those things. So there is plenty of that in there. When the battalion was formed, and the first novel called War, these men and the families did not want to join. They did not want to join the Mormon battalion to go serve. But Brigham Young came forth when Captain James Allen, 1st U.S. Dragoons, arrived from Fort Leavenworth up at Council Bluffs and offered to form this battalion. The only battalion that James K. Polk, President of the United States, was himself involved with, or not organizing, but the concept behind it. It was his idea. It was partially his idea, and no other units had that.
Okay.
It's interesting. Also, I'll just say this right now. The Mormon Battalion is the only religious unit in American history. We've had black units, African American units. We've had Indians, Apache Scouts. We had the Filipino Scouts in the Philippines. We had the 442nd Regimental Combat Team in World War II, which was all Japanese Americans that we sent off to fight the Germans in Italy. Dan Inouye, Senator from Hawaii, who later received the Medal of Honor because of his services in Japan. So we've had ethnic units, a lot of Irish and so on, but we've never had a religious unit. Think about that for a moment.
I hadn't thought about it, but yeah, this is it.
They joined because Brigham Young told them to. He called them. That's why it's entitled Call to War.
Now,
It's
the
a
other
church
book,
calling.
I haven't even mentioned the title of the other. We should. It's War in Far West.
In the Far West.
In the Far West. Okay, so Call to War, and now you explain that title.
Call to War. So if you think about the organization of the battalion, back then the militia, the officers and sergeants, the NCOs, non-commissioned officers, were elected by the men. In the Mormon Battalion, they were called by Brigham Young.
That's
Jefferson
amazing.
Hunt, Daniel Davis, James Brown, all these guys, the sergeants, Daniel Tyler, all of them were called by Brigham
So
Young.
it was a mission.
It was yes, it's been known as called a Mormon military colony. But in my first book on the battalion, then the novels, I strictly want to look at the military aspects, okay? And so the plot lines are a little, they follow history, but a little different. The women, the wives.
Did they pick up and go with them? I mean,
Oh, yes. See, this is another thing that's confusing about the
because
battalion.
I
We had
remember that from
50
somewhere
or
in
60.
history. Yeah.
I hate, it's not always a derisive term, but the Greeks and Romans called them camp followers. And the women and the children would go on campaign. It's been around since the dawn of time. But it's not.
Were they part of the camp?
Yes,
Or were they outside of the camp?
And, but also the Army authorized 4 washerwomen per, or laundresses per company. They didn't receive any money from the Army, no salary. They received funds from doing the wash of Private Smith and Private Jones. You know,
So
2.5
they were paid
cents
personally
by these
okay.
men out of their money, their salaries. They received the rations, which is the food from the Army, and then, of course, transportation, meaning they got the
Terribly
walk.
hard life.
Yes, it was. But anyway, so the women, of course, most of the women didn't go. I mean, there were hundreds left behind. Many of the men were single, but there were still families. But the women were against joining the battalion. However, in a few instances, and that's what I depict as a plot line with Victoria.
Okay, so we have a love story.
Well, we have Victoria, the mother, a widow, 38-year-old widow lady, who is convinced that her 2 sons, York and Arthur, should join the battalion and serve, and they're against it, and she's in favor of it.
Interesting.
So I changed that. It's absolutely plausible because it happened a few times. Now, they grew up with a hatred of the military because their father served under Wellington, fictional father,
yes,
served under
okay.
Wellington against Napoleon on the Peninsula campaign, and also at Waterloo. He was nearly killed at Waterloo. Now, this is fictional. And he gave up his commission as a major in the British Army to 30th Foot, which is infantry, to become a Methodist minister. And one of the lecturers that he ordained in England was John Taylor, fictionally.
Okay.
We know John Taylor
Right.
was a lecturer or exhorter with the Methodist following in England and then later in Canada. And he was in Canada when he was introduced to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. So Victoria meets John Taylor at the Missouri River, and you'll have to read the novel, okay?
Tell me the rest. I want to know all of it.
You'll have to read the
So-
novel.
So, okay, so we've got women, we've got children, we've got men. Are there animals too? I know.
Well,
First time I
actually-
was in a film, they said you're up against it. You've got animals to compete with and children to compete with, and so, what have you got in here? A little of everybody and
Victoria,
everything?
yeah, Victoria is a landed gentry of England, the middle of the Westmoreland shires and so on, up in the Midlands of England, and she can speak 2 or 3 languages, and she loves literature, and so she names her oxen Chaucer, Keats, Byron, and so on.
That's great. That is.
And so she
And
has
you've got them in there?
Yeah, oh yeah, yeah. And so and she's always quizzing the boys, her 2 twins, about, she'll start a line in literature and who wrote it and when and what's the rest of the lines, And one of the famous ones, of course, is King Henry V's, we noble few, we band of brothers, for he that sheds his blood with me today on St. Crispin's Day is my brother. Which is one of the greatest military
Yep.
speeches of all time. But it's fiction, so we shouldn't care about it, right?
Right, well, no.
So there's that. And then I also wanted to share this. Not all the saints that came from England were like Victoria, of the middle class, had money, had education. So I developed a family called the Hitches, and they are the laboring class. And one of the daughters falls in love with either or brother because they look just like each other.
Twins, okay.
Twins. And then she finally discerns which one she's really in love with. But she doesn't have the education. She doesn't have the poise. She's a pretty young woman, but she doesn't have that upbringing. But Victoria helps her, and her family is a big embarrassment. But they're the salt of the earth people. They work hard and mean well, and there's several conflicts between those 2 cultures, those 2 classes. England was riddled with strife because of the classes, the nobility, the aristocracy, the church, and so on.
It's interesting, having lived many years on the East Coast in the Carolinas and then moving to Utah and then going to California. I was raised around people that talked about class.
Mm-hmm.
You were on this side of the tracks or the other,
Right.
and your heritage determined pretty much what your class was.
Sure glad that doesn't happen in Utah,
No. Smiths, Tanners, Youngs, okay. That was me moving into East High School, you bumped into it there. Well, this is really interesting. Again, to our audience, thank you for being with us today. And my guest is Lieutenant Colonel Sherman Fleek. He has stepped away from writing history for West Point, and he has written these 2 novels, which are, I can see where the first one's compelling. So compel me into the second one because it's a continuation. So does this book stand alone? And right in the middle of your talking, a thought crossed my mind,
All right.
which I'm almost going to apologize for. But because my background is film and, movies and television, we got movies here?
Well, if some wealthy investors, you talked about investors and so on, if they are success, I could see them in movies. Of course I could.
Well, just listening to it, I think
Yes,
it's very
I mean,
compelling. It is the very fact that this is the only unit of LDS, of Mormon people, to be in a war per se as a group, I think is very compelling. The
Yes.
fact that you've taken, people want to know the truth, so you've got the truth here, but you weave it around with family, with people we can relate to. That could be me, that could have been my mother, my brother, whatever. So then does this end, does it stand on its own, this first novel, as a finished book? Or do we see these characters moving on?
Yeah, they are in the second book, and what happened was when I finished the novel 2+ years ago in draft form, it was 1,400 pages long, and I knew no publisher would publish it, so I got out Solomon's sword and cut it in half. And the best place to do that was at Santa Fe, because about 80 men were not discharged, but they were relieved from the battalion. They went to what is Fort Pueblo in Pueblo, Colorado, and all the wives and the kids went also, except for 4 or 5 women that made it all the way to California. So that was a perfect place to have, and this adds to the plot, Victoria have a situation. I won't go into it.
Okay, we have to read the book. Okay, we're going to do it.
But she has a situation with the boys, and she is basically left behind. And she has to go to Fort Pueblo.
But she was the one that wanted them to
That's
join.
right,
So
that's right.
why
So it's
was
kind
she
of a
left behind?
Well,
You're not going
because
to tell me.
Well, Cook, Colonel Cook, Philip St. George Cook, West Point class, 1827. Got that in.
Is
real
St.
quick.
George named after that particular person? Is in St. George, Utah?
Oh, no, that was named after George Albert Smith.
How do we get St. George out of?
Well, he was a
George
saint,
for
St.
George?
George. It's
Okay,
just, I
all right.
think that's why they called it St. George.
Okay. Well, when I
The
read
St. George
that,
people, yeah.
I
Well, that
read
was his
last
middle.
night, so.
Philip St. George Cook. He was a Virginian, and not only did he command a Mormon battalion from Santa Fe all the way to California, he served in the 2nd U.S. Dragoons during the Utah War 10 years later. So he's serving with the Mormons. Then 10 years later, Cook, Army professional, Dragoon, a cavalryman, is in the Utah War under Albert Sidney Johnston, the army that come out to impose federal authority against the Saints and relieve Brigham Young as territorial governor. But anyway, that's novel number 3.
You just mentioned from the East Coast, that's a 3,000-mile trek.
Well, they came out of Leavenworth, Fort Leavenworth, Kansas.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it
And
wasn't.
I have a map.
It's still a
in the
long,
novels.
long.
Yes,
I
there's
mean,
maps.
has
See?
anybody ever carried a war across the plains at such an extent?
Well, yeah, I mean, yes, absolutely. Oh, and by the way.
On foot?
Yeah, I just want to say this, another myth.
Okay, I'll take
a great myth in Mormon battalion folks is that it was the longest march in history. Longest military march, longest infantry march, longest infantry march in U.S. history. Well, it was none of those. Alexander the Great marched 22,000 miles with sandals, all right, in about a 10-year period. But
So nobody's matched that.
oh,
And maybe
no,
that's,
no.
thank goodness.
It was over a 10-year period, but one year he marched 2,500 miles. The battalion marched roughly 2,000 miles. And who cares how long the march is? Miles is miles. Anyone can go out and march. But where the route of the battalion went, down through Santa Fe, through modern-day Kansas.
Okay, you started to say something about the map, so let's go back to
Yeah,
that
well,
map.
I have a map in the beginning of each novel.
Those of us that are very visual have to know
depicts
these things.
The first half of the march
Okay.
to Santa Fe, then the second novel has the second half of the map
Okay.
that goes all the way to California. But where they went through, the deserts, the terrain, the mountains, is just incredible. I mean, I drove my Ford Ranger pickup truck up to the top of Guadalupe Pass, which is right on the border of New Mexico and Arizona, and you go to the west about 40 miles is Douglas, Arizona, right there on the border. And as an Army guy, having served in a tank battalion, having served with aviation and all those assets, big heavy equipment, I marveled how they got oxen and wagons over Guadalupe Pass. They had to lower some of the wagons by ropes and take everything out, put them on pack mules, move the pack mules over, disassemble the wagons, drop them down. And it's just amazing that Cook did that, and the men right there with him. It's not the distance of the march. It's
the difficulty.
Yes,
Yeah.
and there were 3 times where the march discipline completely broke down, and they straggled so badly that they lost command and control, basically.
So they didn't die from battle,
No.
but surely people were lost along the way. I feel like I'm listening to a pioneer story of crossing the
Well,
plains.
it is a pioneer, but military operations and campaigning is pioneering too. Lewis and Clark.
True.
So if you think of it that way, there were 22 soldiers that died with the Mormon battalion, all from natural causes.
How many again?
Of about roughly 500, just over 500. There's not an exact count because some used aliases, some signed up and didn't show up at Leavenworth and so on. And then people left and went. So it's roughly just over 500, but 22 died from natural causes.
Now, I have to tell you, over the years, I've had people say to me, oh, let's go rough it this weekend. Let's camp out. And I have to tell you that my idea of roughing it is the penthouse of the Marriott Hotel without enough towels. And so would you explain to me why a woman with her children would get involved in this type of a trek? I mean, I love men. I understand that. But that's a horrible trek to go by choice.
Well, that's one reason I admire him. Do I think, as a military professional, that women should go on campaign with family and kids? like this during time of war? Absolutely not. But that's what happened. It's history. So I marvel and admire them. The love was strong, but the whole church was on the move. They were all heading
Well, that's
west.
true. They're being sent.
And this is another
Yeah,
unique
okay.
situation. The Mormon battalion soldiers and families did not have the comfort of knowing their other family members were home and safe at home and hearth.
No way.
These
No way
folks
of
were on
knowing.
the move themselves. They were out in Iowa, and then they wintered, and then some of them, not all of them, moved on to Utah the next year, and then other years, and so on. And so they were out in the wilds on the frontier with all the diseases and all the calamities of wagons falling over.
And this is all in your novels.
Yes, because, well, pioneering, or just to march down through there, I'll just give you one clue. I have a mishap with Victoria and her wagon. It slips over the side of a small little cliff, a creek bed, and it's damaged, it's destroyed, and lose one of her oxen. And, for a stately English woman to deal with that kind of heartache, she never would have experienced that in England.
Never.
Never. Well,
That's where I
maybe
am with, that's where I am
Chase
with an
a Poston.
RV, camping by a waterfall
Well,
somewhere.
it's not likely. A Poston 4 in England doing the midnight run with the mail could slip and so on. But anyway, it's just they wouldn't encounter Indians.
Would I say you have some cliffhangers?
There are, especially at the end of the first novel, because I did the Solomon sword thing, and there's several unresolved issues and conflicts.
So you had to cut
So
this. Okay.
people will hate me at the end of the first novel,
'Cause they have to
and
go buy the
start liking
second
me
one.
again in the second. But I want to share a couple other plot lines. One thing.
Good.
At the beginning, I introduce a modern character, Major Richard. I call him Rip Howard, non-LDS.
Oh, yeah, I
Rip
noticed
Howard,
that,
Major Howard. He
some
is the
literary
narrator.
device.
Yes,
What
he's
is
a
that?
literary device. He's like Ishmael, even though Ishmael was part of Moby Dick, but he's the narrator. He's in the background. He is assigned by his a colonel, PhD in history, to do a monograph. Okay, and for his year of at Commanding General Staff College at Fort Leavenworth, and so he's working on history, and he's told he should do this on the Barlows. Here's this family, 4 or 5 generations of Army, a couple Navy guys here and there, Marines. We have to be fair. And then later, when we have airplanes, in the Army Air Forces. All right. So 4 or 5 generations of Barlows. Unsung heroes, one of those solid families that serve, die. Families live out in these podunk forts, all the privations, and who's heard of them? But they were right there with Grant and Sherman and Pershing and MacArthur. They're right there. They're on staff. They're never generals
But they're
at the
there.
highest level, but they're the guys, the NCOs, the sergeants, the lieutenants and captains and majors that make the Army work. And the Navy and the Marines, like I said, I introduced. And so through his study of the Barlows and his research, we get that story. And then every 3rd or 4th chapter, I have draft. It's called Draft, Major Howard's draft. And he will give the reader the background
Like a
of the
narrator?
event.
Kind of like a
Yeah,
narrator?
the event. Okay, this is why the Whigs were against the declaration of war and the Polk and the Democrats were in favor of it. This is what happened at the Battle of San Pasqual in December 1846 with the Californios. This is what slavery meant to America. I have a runaway slave in this novel, key character, fictional character. And I have a guy hunting him, a Missouri slave hunter, who becomes a lieutenant in one of the Missouri regiments.
Not bounty type?
Yeah.
Is it
Oh, yeah,
bounty
they had
hunter?
bounties. Oh, yes. Fugitive slave law that came along later, but it's also in the Constitution. But anyway, I have a slave that allies himself with the Barlows. He's not a Mormon.
Okay.
And a non-member Missourian chasing him.
Wow.
And
Okay.
this will go on for 2 or 3 novels because slavery was a key issue in the Mexican War and the whole aspect of Manifest Destiny at that time.
Well, growing up in the South, I thought I was in the Civil War when I listened to my relatives talk. As recent as recent, they still have arguments and discussions about the Civil War. of that period of time was amazing. Tell us, give me the dates on this. You started what year, and then the second book, and now you're going to go on and bring it up to, we think, perhaps current history somewhere along the line. But what were the years that you started in here, and then where do we wind up in the second novel?
All right.
And in case you did just join us here at the end, these programs are that I have every day at noon. The programs and the guests, these are all archived on pat.utahvalleylive.com. And you can see them anytime. You can email the address to your friends to take a look, and we'd be grateful for that. We also appreciate our local radio station, KHQN 1480 AM, for folks that are driving around in a car during this period of time. And I want to mention that next Monday, Verl Osmond, who was a guest and had so much fun, he will be starting his own program for an hour at 9 to 10 a.m. every day, starting next Monday, and that's going to be fun. And then we have Monica Barber. She'll be starting December 1st and have her own program following mine from 1 to 2. So slowly we're filling up the station with people that really are excited about coming on the air and talking about their particular subject. I'm with my guest today, who is so knowledgeable, is Lieutenant Colonel Sherman Fleek.
Retired.
Retired. Okay, I have to say retired. I don't think you're retired. You're still working. What
Well,
does
it's
that
like the
mean?
Marines. Once a Marine, always a Marine.
Okay, but you're not retired. You are the
I'm retired from the Army.
West Point historian,
Yes.
which means you write the history of West Point as
Collect
it unfolds.
documents,
Okay.
oral history, interviews, yes, all
And
that.
apparently we have that at universities and many other things that I hadn't thought about.
Yeah.
We have historians keeping track of all things. So tell me the years.
Years.
Yeah,
All
let's
right.
talk about the years, because you have said generations and generations, and I'm just curious how much history and compelling history we're going to have from your hand.
The first novel, Called to War, begins in May of 1846. Most of the Saints did not leave Nauvoo in the winter and the cold. They left in April, May, and June. That was the major exodus. There were some left February 4th, and some crossed the ice, a few dozen, in March. And my good esteemed colleague, Bill Hartley, who's a great historian on the Western movement, will appreciate me mentioning that. So it starts in May of 1846.
Okay.
I depict not only the Barlows being in the church making the move across Iowa, but then I also depicting Thomas Kane in Philadelphia, how Jesse Little, a Latter-day Saint, comes to him and wanting help from the government. And then the idea of forming a battalion with General Polk and Winfield Scott, who's known in history as Old Fuss and Feathers.
Right.
All right. And
It's a name you
Secretary of
remember.
War William Marcy, and all the workings and mechanisms of deciding on this battalion back in D.C. So all that's going on. And so this is May 1846. The first novel ends in October of 46 in Santa Fe, where the battalion is divided with the women and the children leaving.
So you really just cover a very short.
Well, that's the first novel. The second
Okay.
novel picks up in October, but then it goes through about March of 1848, about when the war ended.
Okay.
And the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was signed. Now, General Kearney, one of the greatest officers we've ever had, Stephen Watts Kearney, Nebraska is named after him, and John C. Fremont. We've all heard of John C. Fremont, the great explorer. They had a huge feud out in California. And Kearney was a general, Fremont was a lieutenant initially, then a lieutenant colonel, but Kearney had orders to establish a government in Santa Fe
Okay.
and then also California.
Okay.
And Fremont refused to obey that and acknowledge that, and he was later arrested and tried and found guilty for mutiny and disobedience and conduct unbecoming. And I depict that at the end of the novel
But why? Do you have the why in there?
because Arthur, one of my fictitious
Right.
Barlow boys, is with the regulars at this time, and he is a witness to events in the trial.
Okay.
And so the first book starts with Fremont and ends with Fremont, John C. Fremont, as kind of just as appetizers.
And then how far are you going to go? in the future?
I don't know. I've outlined up to 7 books already, up through World War II.
You have to have done an enormous amount of research. It isn't just something that you open a novel and you suddenly have a
Well, yeah.
book in
I've
there.
been studying the Mexican Civil War era in the Frontier Army for years. My thesis in graduate school, which caused my first book,
Right.
History May Be Searched in Vain, is part of that research, and I've just continued it all along. But I depict the clothing, the wagon trains, the houses. There's prostitutes in my books because the battalion
That was
men
part of-
complained in Santa Fe that almost all the women were prostitutes. Now, I don't depict any of that stuff,
Right.
but they're there. They're in
was
the
part of
background.
history.
Okay.
Let's do a couple of things. Let's give a phone number, an address, or something where people can find you if they want to find you.
All right.
And I hate to just put you on the spot with that, so I don't know if you have a website you'd rather give, but let's let folks know who you are.
I don't have a website, but my work email is sherman.fleek@usma.edu.
Okay, you're going to have to do that again.
Okay, at USMA, stands for U.S. Military Academy,
Okay.
.edu.
Okay, let's give the whole thing and spell your name.
Sherman, like the tank, Fleek, F-L-E-E-K, at
Oh, okay.
USMA.edu.
Okay. He's handing me his card. Okay, I can read it off the card. And is there a number that they could call, or you'd rather get an email?
Email's fine.
Okay, let's do the email then. And meanwhile,
I'd
these-
like to share why I'm in town this week.
Okay, let's do that, but then I
Okay.
want to let them know that these books are available at Deseret Book.
Right, yes.
And at Amazon,
Amazon,
at BYU Bookstore.
yes.
And
Other
other
LDS places.
LDS books. Okay, tell us why you're here. I thought it was to come see me.
Oh, well.
First stop.
A Medal of Honor that was awarded to a LDS soldier killed in World War II during the invasion of the Philippines, October 1944, is being donated to the LDS Church. There were 9 Latter-day Saints that received the Medal of Honor. 4 were killed, or so the awards were awarded posthumously, and 5 were not. There's 1 still living, but we had 1 in the
It's the Second World War?
Second World War.
Okay.
And so he's the only one of the 9 who went on a full-time mission. He went on a mission to California in 1939, came home in 1941, late 41, early 42, and a draft card was waiting for him, draft notice. But his name was Leonard Brostrom. He's from Preston, Idaho. And his award is being donated to the LDS Church. So I was part of that, so there's that going on.
Do you have the award? I mean, are you the
No, I don't have it, but I.
carrier who?
No, it's being provided by the folks up in Preston. Been in possession up there with certain folks for a number of years. But on Friday at BYU is a Saints at War conference, and I'm speaking there. And then I'm speaking tomorrow afternoon at 3:00 in the Harold B. Lee Library about Medal of Honor recipients in the church.
Oh, my goodness. Well, I hope we can catch one of those or all of those. If everything else fails, you can find this program again at pat.utahvalleylive.com. I can't tell you how much I appreciate your coming. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you
for
so much.
being
I had
with
a
me.
delightful time.
This
It was
has been
wonderful.
fun and interesting and compelling, much more than I thought it would be. Now you've got me where I've got to go buy these books. Thank you for being with us today. We appreciate Kyani, who is our sponsor, kyani.net. Take a look and see what's there. It's changed my life. Again, thank you for making the trip from New
Thank
York
you.
and being with us. And thank you at KHQN AM 1480 on your radio dial. We appreciate all that you have done for us. We're getting word all the time that more have joined us and from their car and from their home. Have a great, safe weekend.